Welcome to Therapy Facts with Dr. Jenn. Today, we are talking about the Kirk Franklin documentary and the Kirk Franklin interview at Club Shay Shay. The first point is that trauma is intergenerational. That means that the default is to pass trauma from one generation to the next. Whatever the trauma behavior is or the trauma situation, if we are not intentional, we will pass it on to the next generation, to the next generation, and then to the next generation. In Kirk Franklin's case, he talks about in his documentary how his mother was 15 years old when she had him, and that she gave him to a family friend, or she may have been a distant relative, to raise. And then he had also challenges with the child he had as a teenager, and that he was frequently unavailable to that child. So we see that one person's behavior, Kirk Franklin's mom, then impacted at least two more generations than herself. And then, based on what Kirk said about his mother having lost her mother before Kirk himself was born, we see that the mom dying when the grandmother dying when the mother was yet 18 was a traumatic experience. Now, of course, we know that grandma probably didn't die on purpose, but grandmother's death would have been traumatic for Kirk's mom. And then she behaved out of that trauma and conceived Kirk, and then gave him to a family friend. And then Kirk himself conceived a child as a teenager, and then had the relationship with the child that he had that was perpetuating that trauma. So, what you really see in that situation is 4 generations of trauma, or 4 generations impacted by the same trauma. And so, in order to break what they call generational curse, in order to break that chain, that automatic default chain that our unconscious or subconscious would have us to continually repeat, we have to be intentional. And so Kirk talks about how his effort to change that chain, or to break the chain, it was to find out who his father was, and also to go to therapy. Woo, there's that word, therapy. Therapy is so important for helping us to understand what our family history is and how it impacts us. It also is important to help us to understand how to navigate questions that we may have, because very frequently traumatic experiences are not forthcoming in terms of details. People are not forthcoming about the details of traumatic experiences. And so going to therapy can help you have someone to guide you through asking questions, formulating ideas about where to get answers from, looking to see if there are public records of things that happen that were traumatic. That having someone to help you work through that can be very helpful, in the sense of realizing that you're not alone. And again, as I've said before, oftentimes when you say to somebody, hey, my therapist told me to ask you, or my therapist told me to see who you knew who could help me out, that people often stand up and they hunch up and they pay attention when you say, my therapist said to ask you, or my therapist said, how can you help me? And so that communicates the advocacy that the therapist has with you beyond the therapy room. Now, just because you ask for answers, you may not get them, and that's okay. Very often we find that we have to move on. We have to forgive, we have to grieve, forgive, and move on from experiences for which we may never get a real answer, and we may never get a real apology, and we may never get any real accountability. But that's okay, because we can still be intentional about doing things differently. And when we are intentional about doing things differently, and we have the aid of a therapist to help us, then when we get to those pain points that typically are involved in transmitting that trauma to the next generation, we get help. We have help with navigating those pain points so that we won't do the same thing, or we won't respond in the same way that the person before us responded. And so having the lack of availability of a parent is an incredible pain point for a child, whether it's the father, whether it's the mother. And so learning to navigate through that experience can change the trajectory of all the generations ahead. And so it is worthwhile. It is the gift that keeps on giving to process trauma and to be intentional about not passing it to the next generation.